Hello, friends. Welcome. Another live. I love doing lives, but I'm not going to lie to you. I've done 3 podcast interviews already today. Now we're going to go live. In fact, I just finished one 15 minutes before I hopped onto this live, which is why I'm a little bit late. Good to be with you all. I am drinking water. Yeah, I've had 2 cups of blueberry coffee already. I couldn't make it to get my third, so it's water in my cup. Good to be here. Listen, this will be a very interesting and fun conversation. And I will admit, I did set up the title a little bit clickbaity, but there also is some truth to it. I actually have not 1, not 2, but 3 guests on the show joining me. And we're going to talk about the recent Jubilee video with Alex O'Connor debating 25 Christians. It's a monster of a video, but I'm excited. This is a really good group of people that we brought in who have different perspectives and different expertise to kind of help us unpack why we all kind of thought that maybe Alex didn't do a good job, which I know for some of you, really quick, might trigger you because you're used to evangelical apologists doing that kind of stuff. And that's not the angle here, but we are going to talk about it. Hey, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Tim. I'm the creator of the new Evangelicals. Do me a favor, give this video a like. It helps get it sent out to more people on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. So, my guest today, boom, look at that. Woo! Wow. Okay. There's a lot of us. Hi, everyone. We'll start here. We have Kevin Carnahan, who's a scholar of religion. We have Aaron Simmons, a philosopher and also a friend of the show along with Kevin. And then we have Than Christopoulos, a first-timer. Than, good to see you. I would say, Than, the way I categorize you, because you told me make it up as I go, so here I am. I would say that you are someone who definitely reads widely, like me, has some college underneath of his belt, but is well respected in the spaces that you occupy for being a good faith dialoguer and trying to understand things related to philosophy and Christianity. How'd I do?
I'm happy with it, man. Whatever you want to see me as, I'm happy with it, man.
I love that. Well, Than, let's start with you. Thank you. Let's start with you because you were part of this debate that we're going to watch. You were part of the 25-on-1, so to speak, Alex O'Connor debate. So, I mean, give me just your initial thoughts. It has to be pretty cool going on to any major YouTube platform to have a conversation with someone like that.
Yeah, it was really fun. I loved being on set. Something people don't know is I was actually surprised I was allowed to stay on set. I was really sick during the recording and everything. The night before, my friend Tim was worried about me because of how sick I was.
Wow.
And so they were super accommodating. I have nothing but good things to say about working with them. I knew that the format was going to be really tough going into it, so I'm not going to complain about that.
Right.
But it was a really tough format. In hindsight, I still don't really know what I could have done better. I'm not the best rhetorician, but it was a really hard format to get into the nitty gritty, into the details with. What else do you want to know? I guess it was an overall good experience. It was great talking to Alex. Alex and I went out for drinks afterwards too, and that was really fun. So,
okay, well that's helpful. Now, I maybe for the audience's sake, let's just kind of give some groundwork here and kind of so we can build upon what we're going to watch. So this conversation was 2 hours long. Obviously, we'd be here until tomorrow morning if we watched the entire thing. We're not going to do that. What I did was I talked to you 3. I said, hey, why don't you guys pick some clips that you want to respond to and talk about? But Aaron, as we were talking in prep, you brought up a really interesting point because you're a philosopher by training. You teach it professionally, and you brought up how even just this format, and I have a thumbnail I'll pull up here in a minute, of just 25 Christians versus 1 atheist, how the format of what Jubilee is trying to do is kind of problematic just to start off with. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on why you think that, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so it creates a dynamic that makes it seem like deep, substantive, philosophical conversations are things that can be done in sound clips, that can be done in a kind of combative MMA style cage fight. And so the sheer idea that, you've got 25 people all competing for the chair is antithetical to the idea that truth is something that requires, as Wittgenstein says, slowness. He says that philosophers should greet each other and say, take your time. Recently, I was watching an interview with Marilyn Stump, an amazing philosopher herself, and was asked the question, well, does the problem of evil defeat the truth of Christianity? And she starts to answer, and the guy interviewing her keeps kind of cutting in. She's like, look, you're going to have to wait. This is not a question we can even make sense of as a question in the time frame that you're wanting an answer. And so I realize that's not what works well for, YouTube models of, exciting content. But this is also part of why I think apologetics, or the discourse about such things that Alex is doing in the world, is probably maybe more dangerous than it is not when done in formats that don't allow for multiple cups of whatever drink one wants and long-term relational engagement. And this is why when professors and professionals do this work, it's not like, oh, the thing you see televised is the debate. Nope.
Right.
It's we've read each other's works for decades. And so then when we're thinking out loud together, it's because our relationships and the conversation is always in medias res. So I have some good things to say about it in what I saw, but I am concerned about framing philosophical dialogue in a way that is more interested in views than in truth seeking.
Than, do you agree with that? I mean, you were actually there, a part of this conversation, and I did watch a good chunk of it. It did feel like, they had a timer, right? I think the format is you have 10 minutes on a topic, and then if enough red flags are waved by the audience, you have to stop right away and move on. So if you don't keep their attention, or if you're going somewhere that's out of left field, they'll kick you off. Do you kind of feel the same sentiment that Aaron has regarding like just this format in general and how it's kind of doomed from the start?
Yeah, so it was 20 minutes, and then for the flags, it was if half the flags go up in a room, then you get voted off. I'm torn. If I'm really being honest, I lean on agreeing with you, Aaron. That being said, there's also this other side of the coin where this isn't an ends justify the means thing I'm trying to say here either.
Right.
But I am also just kind of curious as to the value that can come out from this. And maybe this is just because I'm an optimist, right? But I'm curious about the value that can come out of this, because how many people out there, for instance, that have never even like considered asking these types of questions are now exposed to them. Yeah. And then maybe they can start going onto their truth-seeking journey for themselves. So it's hard. It's hard, man. I lean on agreeing with you, and I think I do. I also just think that there are some goods that can come out of this at the same time. And I don't know if that's really simplistic, but
I'm kind of with you, Than. I'm kind of in the tension here, and then we'll get back to Aaron. And this, friends, the reason why we're having this conversation before we get into the clips is because I want to set the stage that of how people like myself, more of a layperson, might see something like this compared to someone who is in academia talking about philosophy in a very different way than someone like myself, right? Because Than, I'm like you, where I think that it's good to be able to see different perspectives compete and talk and kind of in debate and have that discussion, right? At the same time, I think that this particular format, where it's like 25 people, some of these Christians, by the way, I mean, we're embarrassing to listen to. There were a few that were just like, oh my God. But whenever something substantive, including your segment, you had a really good talk with him about like the Trinity. I was like, oh, keep going. But then they voted you off, or like the timer ran out, or something like that. Time ran out. And I was like, no, keep going. I want more of that. So I think that like public debates that are more formal, like the 2.5 hour long ones, are actually quite great. I watched a lot of Bart Ehrman debates with him debating inerrantism that I found really compelling for all kinds of reasons. But this particular setup, it did feel more about like, well, how do we get as many views as possible and retain said views, as opposed to like the substance that we're actually talking about. I'm not sure what you all think about that, but that was kind of my view.
No, I agree with that sentiment. I like, you can tell that the way they formatted this and the way they edited everything, it's meant primarily for views. They're a content creation company, and they're not really trying to bias towards any particular viewpoint or anything like that. So yeah, I agree on that aspect. And I think I told you guys privately about this too. I was kind of like contemplating whether or not I should do this. And I kind of just saw it as one of those things that I probably should do, at least for the sake of trying to get the work that I do out there. Because typically what I do is I actually prefer the longer, slower discourse where you can actually cash out some really in-depth ideas and nuance over time. Because I agree with Aaron. Philosophy is best done slowly, and that also extends to even the historical understandings and trying to reconstruct history. I think too. Um, I upset some people a lot, but like I think history in general, on both sides, Christian and non-Christian alike, make a lot of mistakes on epistemic grounds and philosophical grounds, and so that's why I also think these things need to be done very slowly as well.
That's fair. Kevin, any thoughts about any of this before we kind of get into the video?
Yeah, I think it's notable, not just that it's set up a little bit to be almost dehumanizing for some of the Christians when they have to race in to get the chair. And then the other part of it is that I assume that Alex has the ability to set up the questions that are going to be discussed. So he's kind of got the control of the entire situation, and it really is set up as a kind of Alex is going to be the authority here. Everybody else gets to challenge him, but everybody else is obviously on a lower level of authority and a lower level of standing than him from the beginning. So, yeah, I mean, I have qualms about the way that it's set up from the beginning. It seems that it's biased, and it seems that it's set up for Alex basically to beat everybody else. He says at the beginning, God willing, they'll convince me that I'm wrong. But he knows at the beginning that nobody is going to convince him in this setting that he's actually wrong on any of his points. So I just think there's a level of performativity and disingenuousness that's kind of built into it.
I think,
and to that point,
sense.
Kevin, it's just fascinating. So I am not, I want to be clear, suggesting that there is not good that comes from thinking about difficult topics in publicly accessible ways, right? So my critique is not, do this only in the technical mode that you would see at a philosophy conference. I am a public philosopher as a result of 20 years doing academic technical stuff, but it's because I'm so committed to the idea that we've got to invite broader deliberative engagement from a wider audience that I am a fan of doing things like this. We're thinking together about these topics in ways that hopefully people can get excited about. My point about the time it takes to be motivated by truth is something that is maybe best explained. I once was at a academic space, and there was this very famous Christian philosopher of religion named Linda Zebzegski, who is absolutely just a rock star, does wonderful stuff on epistemic trust. And she received a question from another big name philosopher in the audience who says, look, Linda, the problem I have with what you're doing is that I don't think you're even open to the possibility that you could be wrong about theism. And she sort of pauses and looks back and says, well, I'm open to being wrong. I don't think you have the time, right? Like, that is so cool. The idea that what it looks like to change one's mind about what William James will call the core of our belief web, these aren't things that happen quickly. And so I'm with Fan that maybe this plants seeds, maybe it invites awareness, maybe it opens discourse. But if you're going to do that, I think maybe do it in a way that also is showing some of the problems with not just this format, but maybe, and this is something we'll talk about as the show goes on, maybe with the very idea of apologetics, right? Like actually countenance the fact that most philosophers, though not all, find the very idea of apologetics to be deeply problematic as the best way of engaging about truth regarding religious topics, right? So that's where I think there's a broader space that might open more engagement. And I think this model of doing it, though there is some good, and though I should say, I think Alex is engaging. I think he's good at this format. I certainly don't think he's dismissive. There are moments where he even countenances like religious experiences that are claimed that sound kind of kooky. And yet he said, if I had had that experience, I probably would believe as well. Like, there are moments that I think really do speak to honesty. But I think if this is what it looks like to do intellectual versions of Christianity or atheism, I think we have cheapened both.
Yeah. Okay, look, really quick. We're going to get into this video now. I want to be very clear. If you're in the audience watching and you're one of the angry trolls in the comments, which, by the way, as long as you're not dehumanizing, that's fine. I want to be clear about a few things. First off, we're not critiquing the fact that Alex is on this show necessarily. We're critiquing the format that Jubilee has done this format in, meaning they've done this with Charlie Kirk, with Lila Rose, plenty of other people who, by the way, I strongly do not like and disagree with. But what we're commenting on is that the format doesn't really lend itself to the real dialogue that needs to take place to have the in-depth conversations that are needed. A lot of these formats are designed to generate clickbait and like quick viral clips to then give the organization more plays. That being said, as we go along, I want to be really clear. I don't think anyone on this panel thinks that Alex necessarily lost the debate because he's not robust in what he believes, or that there aren't even good points to his arguments. This isn't about if Christianity is objectively true or not. We're talking about the actual debate itself and what happens when you have some actual academics and scholars who know this stuff. What happens when they watch this with you live and getting their thoughts. So that being said, I hope that you really enjoy this video. Let's get into it. I'm going to start playing. Kevin, did you do your pauses again for each clip?
They're occasional, but we'll just jump in whenever we want to.
Just jump in, okay? I don't know when you want me to stop the video. So we're all live here. Let's get into it, and we'll go from there. Here's the beginning. Buckle up, friends. Thanks for being here.
But when a child dies of leukemia,
could there be a purpose to it?
did God command the ethnic cleansing of the land of Israel?
I'm not saying the scribe made something up. I'm saying the scribe has a command.
So where did they get that command from?
From God.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years ago.
I don't know what's happening now. I have to suspect it's some kind of psychological phenomenon. Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast. And today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind.
Okay, I want to say something here. As a content creator, props to whoever made that trailer, because you had to sift through 2.5 hours or more of content to pull some really compelling clips that you go, okay, I'm hooked. I want to keep watching. So I just want to say that. As far as the people behind Jubilee who pulled that, job well done, because I'm engaged. I'm like, wait, yeah, I want to know more too. Yeah, no, tell me more. All right, we'll keep it going.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
Okay, can you stop it there?
You got it, Kevin.
So here's the thing right off the bat. I assume that Alex is the one who came up with these as the topics that he wants to talk about.
Yeah.
This prompt, the way that it's put forward is, and he's got to know this, is blatantly false. As a matter of fact, he is never going to defend this claim at any point in the video, that the existence of evil makes God's existence unlikely. He's got it. He knows that that's false, because there are kinds of evil that are entirely compatible with the existence of God. And this has been given. So the logical problem of evil does not work. You can't just say God is good, God is all powerful, evil exists, and therefore there's a problem, because there are kinds of evil that are entirely compatible with the existence of God, namely evils that might be the product of free will, evils that have an offsetting good. There's all sorts of theodicies that can be brought about to make this point. It's also true that it's not the case that evil, even in the kinds that he's going to talk about, may necessarily make God's existence unlikely. And even he will not claim that. What he's actually going to claim is that there are particular kinds of evil that make God's existence less likely than it would have been had those evils not existed. And so I just find it kind of strange that he starts out with this claim that on its face, he's never actually going to defend, and that is really functionally indefensible. What he's going to end up actually defending is the claim that gratuitous evil makes God's existence relatively less likely. And had he put forward that as the thesis, then I think he would have had a defensible claim. But as it stands, just from the beginning, he doesn't really have a defensible claim here.
But he doesn't, I mean, to be clear, just to push back a little bit here, and I'm not the academic, but the claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely, not evil. Am I missing something here?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to make the claim that he doesn't mean suffering in any moral sense. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with saying in this case that what we're talking about is kind of natural evil, because that's the kind of thing that he actually wants to claim about suffering. So that's a distinction that I don't think needs to come into it at this point. But yeah, I mean, so suffering, there are all kinds of suffering that are compatible with the existence of God and don't cause God's existence to be unlikely in any particular way. He's really talking about a particular kind of suffering, gratuitous suffering, and he's talking about making God's existence relatively unlikely given what we start with. And he'll actually grant all of these points once he gets into the discussion. As you'll see, he doesn't actually want to talk about just all suffering. He wants to talk about particular kinds. And so even him, I mean, this is one of those things that I think if we were participating in the debate, the first thing that you'd want to do is get a little bit pedantic about it and come up and say, that can't be, you can't be serious in what you're actually claiming here to start with, because you've got to know that this argument doesn't work. You at the very least have to be much more careful with what you're actually claiming to make a viable claim in the argument.
And just to further infuriate people who then are saying you're proving the point of why we shouldn't be in that room, like this is horrible TV. Notice it like, and I mean, I do this on purpose to kind of support Kevin's claim, but makes is an action verb that would be deeply troubling for those of us who would try to say, well, wait a minute, how is it that some phenomena constitutes action relative to God's existence? But moreover, this is the whole, what's the definition of is? And there's a whole literature that takes this really seriously, because part of what's happening in the makes word is God is being already stipulatively defined, which is fine. We have to do that. But stipulatively defined as a very particular rationalistic concept, such that God as omnipotent, omniscient, and maximally good, which are the three, classical theistic claims, that makes the very idea of existence now an object-oriented conversation. But as somebody said, like, well, wait a minute, after Kierkegaard, haven't these ideas shifted? Yes. And not just after Kierkegaard, after all of the postmodern reaction to the capital R rationalism of modernity itself. So I identify as a Pentecostal Christian, but I would say weird things like, part of why I'm a Christian is because I don't think God's existence is very interesting. Because I'm trying to challenge what we mean by existence as the stake of the debate, right? So the whole framing is one that assumes God is first and foremost understood as object. That object can be referenced in immediately and easily predicatable ways relative to human action verbs. And existence is the most important thing about that object. And yet, that just seems to fall flat when it comes to anyone working in a broadly postmodern or deconstructive, not deconstructed Christianity, but deconstructionism, Derrida and others. Those of us working in that space, God's existence is like so not the point. And I know that will infuriate people, but that's part of the problem, right? Is these questions, these ideas are so complicated and fraught that if we just jump in and think, all right, I'm claiming X, and now in a mock trial, simulation, you guys come at me and you've got 5 minutes and I've got 2 minutes to respond. This is theater. And that's fine, because theater is also awesome. But to think that theater is really doing the hard work that philosophers take seriously, I would suggest we're moving so fast. This is why my philosophy of religion class starts with a month of what are we talking about when we talk about God? Are we talking about Christianity? So it's philosophy of Christianity, or are we actually doing philosophy of religion? If we're doing philosophy of religion, what do we mean by religion? And it turns out I start off with 50 different definitions of religion. And then we read critical theorists of religion who come in and say, look, maybe religion is a product of academic discourse about something that we call religion, right? So all of that is not something we need to unpack today, but just to illuminate what we mean when we say, y'all slow down, right? The model of rationalistic combat already might miss the most interesting things about religious existence in the first place.
I mean, what I hear you saying briefly is that, the presuppositions we come to the table with about how we understand God need to be challenged way more than what Alex and these people are challenging, right? Like, we're starting from a presupposition that if this is the claim, yes, I mean, we can see God as maybe improbable in this potential framework for a lot of people, but there are actually deeper questions to ask about even the very fact that we're asking what is God and what does existence mean that lead us down much more fascinating questions and conversations. Is that a fair summarization, Dan?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just to piggyback off this, and I'll keep this really short and sweet to the point, because I don't think we're going to cover my friend Tim's dialogue with Alex on this question, and that's totally fine. But you guys probably understood enough of what Tim was saying, and what Tim says. When I'm saying Tim, I'm not talking about the host of this show. I'm talking about my friend Tim, who talked on the problem of evil here. Alex and I and Tim, when we went out for drinks afterwards, we spent 3 hours unpacking Tim and I's approach to the problem of evil, and it took until then for Alex to go, oh, I think I get what you're saying now, but look how long it took for us to get there. And it's because Alex's assumption of what gratuitous suffering really means, what are the theoretical contents of that label, it took time to unpack what his assumptions are versus what we take gratuitous suffering to be. Yeah. And you just can't do that here. So,
okay, listen, we are 30 seconds in. We got to keep moving.
Yeah.
Good work.
Hey, Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why is suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely.
If we can intervene again, I just find this. I don't know if I don't follow him in this or what's going wrong. I mean, so species don't die, and species certainly don't suffer. So the whole argument that 99% of species have gone extinct really, it just seems like a strange way to go. What he seems to be talking about primarily as you go is actually about predation, which he doesn't get to here. And just the idea that God is, so going back to some of the stuff that Aaron was talking about, God is apparently for him the kind of thing that sets up a system that, is picking natural selection and doing this. That seems to me to be raising a lot of questions about how he conceives of God. Is God the kind of being or non-being that sets up a world in which there are possibilities and then those possibilities come about? Or is God the kind of being that has meticulous providence that's going through and causing individual things to happen along the way? I mean, he's got a whole conception of God that he's bringing to the conversation that I don't think you can immediately apply to the conversation. I mean, in some ways, he's picturing God as setting up a game that sets creatures competing against each other, instead of setting up, like I would tend to think of it, setting up a world in which there are particular possibilities, and those possibilities include things like suffering, but those things like suffering have to be allowed in order to allow other creative possibilities to exist in the world. And when you talk about something like natural selection, I mean, natural selection is a great example of something where there's magnificent creativity. There's also massive amounts of suffering that go on. So then the question is, how could you set up a world that allows for these possibilities, allows for these creative possibilities? And what are the possibilities for suffering that have to be allowed to allow for that kind of creativity, or those goods that are set up? And I don't know, man, at that point, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I don't know what the conditions are for that entirely.
But what I hear, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because what I hear Alex essentially saying is that, look, if God is, at least in how many Christians say think about God, all powerful, all good, all omniscient, he is the most powerful being ever. He spoke the world into existence. Out of all the potential of how God could have set things up, why would he set up a world where things can die and can suffer how they, as they die, including human beings? Like, why would God choose that? Why would God choose, essentially what I hear Alex asking? I could be wrong, but the question I would ask is, out of all the possible multiverses, why are we dealing with this one where kids are dying of cancer and things really, tragically are actually happening? That maybe he didn't say it the right way, but I think that is the ultimate question that I think he's trying to get to.
But I think, okay, go ahead.
No, sorry, you can keep going if you want to. I was just going to do a really short, steelman, I guess, or of what Alex is really trying to get at, which is, and you're right, by the way, that there's a lot of assumptions that go into this, which is the basic idea he's poking at is, look, if God exists as defined by Christians, I wouldn't predict that we would see a world like the one we live in right now, where you see all these types of things, because if I'm Alex, perfect lovingness would not allow for gratuitous, pointless suffering and the wastefulness of things like evolution and stuff like that. And so he's just looking at some data that we see in the real world and saying this is unexpected or even surprising on the condition God exists relative to naturalism. So therefore, this is evidence against God's existence.
Can I just flesh this out a little bit more too? Because I want to just be clear, I think what you're saying, Aaron and Karen, I really hear you about the presuppositions of what we even talk about with God. I think it's all fair. I think that what makes Alex's point here so appealing, even to me as someone who's a theist, right, is that I grew up in a worldview that God was this being controlling everything. I grew up in this American Calvinist tulip theology, right, where John Piper says all suffering, including the sexual assault of women, was decreed by God for his glory that one day we'll find out. And if that's the God we're talking about, I'm with Alex. If that is the scenario where this all-powerful being just went, you know what, out of my infinite goodness, I'm going to set things up so this exists, I would just be like, untenable. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but on that model, I'm an atheist too, right? So the whole point becomes, what then happens is, and I think this is important, showing that certain models of the divine articulated within particular historical traditions should be non-starters because of some deep moral intuitions we have about just existence and the moral dignity found within. I'm in with that. And he does go on later, which we don't have a clip of this, but he does mention, I think, the best version of the argument that he's trying to present, which is developed by John Schellenberg, a friend of mine, amazing guy, who suggests, look, the thing is, it's why don't we see God step in to prevent some of this or to respond to some of this? It's more like an argument about God being a negligent parent, more than, therefore there is no God. It's to say, which are we going to choose? A negligent parent who's almost cruel, it would seem, at least indifferent, if not cruel, or that there is no parent to begin with. And so we should expect that stuff's going to look like it sucks. And this is part of the deal, right? So I think that argument actually has lots of weight and traction because it's framed slightly differently. And to Alex's credit, he does mention that as the conversation goes on.
Yeah, I really wish that we had Trip Fuller or Tom Ord here to present some process theology for a little bit. But I mean, it's what. But Tripp does say when I first interviewed him. He said, "I'd rather be an atheist than a Calvinist," and I was like, "Yeah, honestly, me too." But anyway, that's just my own take. Okay, Than, did you want to add to this, or can we keep going here?
No, man. Let's just keep going because I could talk about this stuff for.
I know. We could all nerd out. I'm really enjoying this. This is a lot of fun, friends. By the way, if you're here, you're just joining. Welcome into the stream. Give this video a like; it'd be so helpful. I know for some people this is like rubbing up against them in the wrong ways. I understand that, but keep an open mind. This is pretty deep stuff, and we're trying to do what we can in the time that we have. So let's keep going. All right.
Theism, if you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, you know, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some, Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth.
I like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
Okay, hold on. That claim just seems to me extreme. I mean, that if we were put in a Rawlsian like state of nature, and we were able to become an animal in the world, we didn't know. So presumably we don't know what animal we're going to become. We're able to look out at all of the different animals in the world. We would rather kill ourselves than become any animal in the world. That just seems, I don't know how you could justify this claim. And I don't know how he's imagining the lives of all the animals that have existed in the world. I mean, it's just a fact that like suicide is not a common phenomena among other animals. This is not, however it is that they actually exist and actually perceive the world. The idea that they would be better off not existing appears not to be a phenomena in any other animals than humans. And I don't think it's the case that if we looked out and, had the opportunity to be any human, we would rather kill ourselves than do this. This just seems hyperbole at best, or an incredibly pessimistic view of the world. I just don't see how you get it off the ground at all in the argument.
Well, and there's also an argument called the futurity argument, or sometimes developed as the futurity paradox relative to obligations to future generations. Derek Parfit and others have argued this. And the idea is that there's reasons to think that existence as such has a kind of moral quality that outweighs any suffering one could endure. Now, I don't want to defend that argument. I'm just suggesting the ease with which Alex deploys, well, this is what you would decide. It turns out there's a whole debate in just how we understand the good of existence that is deeply, deeply in play, right? And the basic argument would be, it turns out that if you did anything differently today, it would potentially create different beings later. And so the beings that weren't created would have some sort of moral beef with you. You would be morally blameworthy for not allowing their existence. And so it's kind of a reductio move, right? Which is the idea that it leads to an absurd set of conclusions if we start with particular premises that might be contested. So I'm actually, I should say, more sympathetic, I think, to the intuition that Alex is operating from. Maybe I'm not more than Kevin, but I'm wanting to kind of, since Kevin is doing a good job of saying, whoa, I was like, yeah, but let's be honest, the reality of gratuitous suffering, the amount of gratuitous suffering, these are really good reasons to think that a lot of the stories about the divine and the Theodicies that have been offered trying to justify this suffering in light of some greater good, I think those should give us a lot of pause. So I'm very sympathetic to hiddenness arguments. And yet again, I think this whole thing acts as if rationalism is going to be ultimately the decider of stuff about debates and issues that are fundamentally going to resist that kind of discourse. So I'm on the idea of, on the side that says we do this work to break down unbelief so that we are open to other possibles, not so that we have convinced someone of what they should believe, because to do that is asking more than arguments about the divine are going to be able to do.
Mhm.
The other thing I noticed here, and tell me what you guys think about this, because this is actually just a thought that popped up in my head now, to be honest with you, which is he's kind of poking at somebody, your intuitions when he's doing this, but he's kind of poking at folk intuition when it comes to whether or not somebody would choose to do X, Y, or Z. But I don't know if I find that entirely probative for whether or not some sort of moral truth can come out of this. And what I mean is, like, Alex is asking this future statement, like, if I told you you could be part of this story here where this pain and suffering is going to happen, et cetera, you would refuse to do it. But how many times do we have the inverse of that being true, where somebody goes through some sort of story with horrific suffering, but they've come through triumphant, and that type of suffering hasn't rendered their life like meaningless on the whole. They're like, they still consider their life worth living on the whole. And a lot of those types of people, when you ask them if you could erase that part of their past, they would say, no, I've actually come to treasure that aspect of my life. So what that tells me is there's something about us that our intuitions tell us, hey, don't go down the unpredictable path, avoid the pain, avoid the suffering. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that that suffering is unjustified and that that those things are intrinsically not worth pursuing, such that, like, again, it would render your life on the whole bad, in light of the fact that we have the opposite being true. And so all I'm trying to get at here is, like, this intuition pump that he's doing, I don't actually think is doing enough work to justify what he wants to do. Do you get what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Even if his argument were correct that we wouldn't choose to jump into a world with that suffering, that doesn't mean that had we jumped into that world with that suffering, it might not be that we found it fulfilling in the end in any case. I think that that's true. And so he might be appealing to an intuition that is problematic from the very beginning.
This is such an interesting stream because I'm reading the comments as you guys are talking. Also, someone asked if I could put your names underneath your videos. Unfortunately, I can't, guys. I don't have that ability right now, so apologies. But we have in the Eagle, not Philadelphia Eagles hat, but the bird hat, we have Kevin Carnahan. The guy with the headphones with the plaid is Aaron Simmons, and to my left is Stan Christopoulos. So that's who's hanging out with me. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, here's what I feel like is happening. I'm just going to kind of try and cut through some of this, right? I feel like on one hand, we're watching Alex debate Christians on the presupposition of, like, the classical argumentation of what God is. This all-powerful, all-good, omniscient being that many people who grew up in these worlds, like me, grew up with. And then responding to this is two academics who moved past that view of God a long, long time ago, like maybe decades ago. We're like, yeah, no, that view is crazy. It makes no sense. I understand. And so what's happening is kind of this, like, juxtaposition. And then I don't know where you are with that, so I just didn't want to, like, lump you in and assume. But, like, what I'm seeing is
I have
like,
really nuanced views, and
okay, and that's fair. But what I'm seeing is, like, a weird juxtaposition of, like, we're watching this stream, watching Alex talk about things with these presuppositions in place, and then both of you are like, actually, like, you know, there are different ways to think about theism or God or divine, whatever, that leave some of these very problematic, you know, views of God behind, but still leave room the possibility for there to be some kind of divine thing. Am I summing up, like, what you guys are laying down? That's kind of how I see this stream going so far. Yeah, and then be people in the chat who hate it.
Yeah, I would qualify a little bit in that I don't think I want to give up ideas of, like, omnipotence or omniscience, but I don't mean those in a kind of naive way, which I think a lot of people have very naive pictures of what, like, omnipotence means, where they think, oh, that just means God can do anything whatsoever. And you don't have to get very far into philosophy of religion to realize that the idea that God can do anything whatsoever is, like, a logical non-starter. because God, as long as God's activity is going to be meaningful and coherent, like make any sense whatsoever, then God can't violate things like logical impossibilities. So, for instance, God can't allow a libertarian free will decision and determine what the outcome of the decision will be, because that's a contradiction. And so it just makes no sense to say that God could do both of those things. And then the question is, okay, what all else are the conditions under which God is working when God creates? Like, what other things does God have to accept are like logical limits that God can't violate? And again, this is why I said, like early on, my question oftentimes is, what kinds of possibilities of evil does God have to allow in order to allow a world in which the goods that are possible in our world exist? And the answer to that is, I don't really know. Because that goes beyond what I'm able to figure out on my own. Just to give another example, like,
question,
yeah,
Kevin?
Go ahead.
Because I think I would agree with you. Sorry to cut you off. This is really nagging me because I really want to ask you this. When you say you don't know, I think I agree with you. So long as you're saying, like, we can put up a bunch of models, which I just would take that to be Theodicies and just our natural theology. We can put up a bunch of models to try to explain how it could work, but which one of those models is true, we don't really know. Is that what you're trying to get at when you say that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, for instance, it would be, I might think it would be nicer if we had a world where we could communicate better with each other, where we communicated better where we instantly understood what the other person meant, right? And I might think that would be a much better world, right? But then I think, a lot of the creativity in humanity is because we misunderstand each other. Like, a lot of what happens when humans are creative is somebody says something, we actually misunderstand them, but it creates a new idea because we misunderstand them in a way that, like, it brings a new idea into our heads. And so even when I try and repeat what you have said, I'm actually ending up creating something new. And if we were better at communicating with each other, right, we wouldn't have that creativity. Now, there's an example of a place where you might think immediately, oh, I know what would make the world better is X. But if you think about it a little bit, you're like, but actually bringing about that, a kind of world where that were the case, might actually have other costs in terms of other goods, creativity, etc., that I hadn't thought of. And the problem is there are so many of those possibilities around in the world that I just don't know what all they are. And I wouldn't want to pretend to know what all they are.
Yeah, no, I love that.
I would tweak it a little bit just to say, for me, it's not about models, Fan. It would be, I as an open theist, if Tom Ward were here, I would say he's wrong to think that he's answered the problem of evil. I don't think he has. I think the problem of evil is intractable for all conceptions of any notion of a creator God who is defined by love. And so the fact that it's intractable, though, I think is just misguided to understand that as somehow this defeater that then wrecks the possibility of living into the hope that also might be located in some of those narratives, right? So I don't want anybody to think what I'm suggesting, and I certainly, Kevin and I are very good friends, neither of us are suggesting that, the problem of evil goes away when you reconceive God. No, it just becomes different and looks different, and it gets discussed differently. And anyone who acts like you can somehow just, solve the problem of evil, whether in classical theistic apologetics or in Tom, who is also a good friend, Tom Ordian process, God is love, therefore there's no worry here. Both of those, for me, minimize the existential reality that we are daily confronted with when we see, continuing genocides, when we see suffering, when we see dishonesty, when we are invited to be cruel in order that our power be maximized. None of that makes any sense to me. But I don't think that, therefore, this possible account of how joy looks or how love works are therefore false. And that's what I mean by trying to resist some of this pushback, right?
I love you all. We are going to be here till midnight if we don't keep going. We have to keep going.
Can I say one thing?
Jesus.
I'll make it really
give
quick.
You this solo. Go ahead, Dan.
This long rant that we just all went on. This is the whole entire point, because presumably what Alex wants to do, and he says this later on, I don't know if it's in this video, but in the Jubilee video, he says this is an internal critique. But the only way that you're going to be able to make an internal critique to either bring out a logical contradiction within the worldview or probabilistic tension between two propositions within the worldview is if you actually know the whole contents of the worldview. And the fact that we were able to sit here and talk about all these different models of God and these models of goodness and what better means and all this other stuff is the whole entire reason why this argument is problematic and this format's problematic. That was my short way of doing it.
Yeah, I'm reading some of these comments, like Alex cooked them so bad and you guys look bad. It's like, dude, the whole point that we're trying to draw out is that the entire premise of these debate styles are flawed, which is why we think Alex and really the Christians there lost. Everyone lost, guys, okay? Spoiler alert. Like, no one looked really that great, and it undermines the bigger problem of that these are really complicated topics that have universes and multiverses and galaxies inside of them that we could explore, right? And when you take things like this, and this is our problem, I think, with the internet that we talk about often, with anything that's short form or designed more for clickbait than actual dialogue, you end up doing all this stuff where you're just trying to get similar to that intro video that they made, that stinger, it's what it's called, where it's like, oh, bam, he owned him, that we can go viral. But is it actually doing the work of making us think more deeply and critically about why we believe what we believe, even if you're not a Christian or a theist, right? Like, we all have to be able to hold our own thoughts in tension with the realities that other people see the world in different ways, and maybe there's something to learn there. So anyway, it's hilarious. This is maybe, I gotta say, it's your fault, all three of you, for bringing on so much hate in my chat for the first time. No, I'm just kidding. It's all good. The YouTube algorithms is finding the people that love Alex, which, by the way, I like Alex. I watch a lot of his stuff. I think it's really compelling. So yeah. All right, let's keep going. We will be here all day.
Afterwards. We had a good time.
Yeah, exactly. All right, here we go.
So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur? Ooh. So close. Hey.
Nice to meet you. My
How's
name's
it going?
Hayden. How are you?
Hayden. Nice to meet me.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because, of course, you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering needs the existence of the world, that it's theism, but granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe.
Okay.
Can you stop it there? So I just want to jump in at this point and say this is exactly what I was saying at the beginning about the fact that his original premise was unsupportable. What he's just done is qualified it in ways that make it different from his original premise. So he specified that he's talking about gratuitous evil, and then he said, I'm not saying that it makes God unlikely overall, because I'm not calculating in the likelihood or unlikelihood of existence per se, right? I'm saying, granted the existence of the world, then how do you make this decision? And those qualifications are really significant in this kind of debate, because what it means is that the theist actually is on much better grounds than it seems that the theist would be given his original premise.
Hold on. Pause for a second. Pause. Guys, I'm just going to be honest with all of you out there. If you feel a little lost in some of this, I understand, because I feel a little lost in some of this. But we're going to get there. This is big stuff. And all of my guests, by the way, we're all cool, so I can say this live. It's not a big deal. But I know for a lot of you, you're like, wait, what are we talking about? I get that. One of the reasons why I decided to do this live was to actually make that point of just how complicated and how like deep some of these conversations go. So before we kind of resort on either side of this conversation to real easy clickbait gotcha moments, just know that there are people, theists and not, who really think deeply about this stuff. And also I will say to all of the Alex fans in the chat who are cooking me, I'm cool with it. Like as long as you don't dehumanize, I'm all about it. I like Alex too. It's all good. I'm enjoying the conversation. So yeah, I mean, Kevin, I kind of follow. Does anyone want to add on to this? And just keep in mind,
I can unpack that.
Yeah, we need, and this is no, I'm not giving you shit, Kevin or Aaron, because you guys are brilliant people. You know, I love you. We talk all the time. But like, I am a little lost in some of this stuff, and I'm just a little bit like, what are we actually talking about here?
Let me try to unpack this, and Kevin, correct me if I'm not interpreting you correctly. Here's an analogy, right? Imagine you have like a crime scene and you have two murder suspects, and let's just say you have evidence 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all supporting the hypothesis that person A did the crime, and then you come up against one piece of evidence that supports person B doing it. That's evidence 6 or whatever. I already lost track of my numbers, right? But just pretend you have all this evidence for one person and one piece of evidence for the other person, right? Mm-hmm. The totality of the evidence is still going to favor person A over B. And so even if we grant that that last piece of evidence supports the proposition that person B did it, we can still say, well, look, we have all this other stuff in the background when we're assessing that one data point that supports the idea that person A did it over person B. In the same way, what I think Kevin's pointing to is the fact that when you're assessing the problem of evil in the vacuum and just assuming things in the background, meaning like consciousness, fine-tuning, whatever you want to say, existence, a universe, you can't just say whether or not God's existence is likely or not, given a vacuum of that data point, which is suffering. You have to kind of take into account everything together holistically. Otherwise, you're going to come to misguided judgments. Am I right, Kevin?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So I would say, so number one, I threw out the term gratuitous suffering or gratuitous evil. Gratuitous evil is just a kind of evil that has no apparent offsetting good. A kind of evil that, so some evils presumably help us to grow. Like some evils might be because we made choices and so our freedom is an offsetting good. A gratuitous evil is what he's trying to get to with the suffering of the deer, because it doesn't seem that there's any immediate offsetting good, or we don't know what that offsetting good would be. So that's a particular kind of evil that he's specified. And then, just as Sam was saying, this is in a broader context where we have to talk about other arguments about God, other accounts. And he knows this. I mean, as he says, well, it might be that you would want to argue that the world is less likely to exist at all if God doesn't exist. And so it really depends a lot where you start with these arguments. Because if I start with the argument, well, it's unlikely that the world would exist at all without God, therefore, since the world exists, it's highly likely that God exists. And then I go to the problem of evil and I say, oh, this makes it slightly less likely that God exists. Then I'll still end up with the conclusion that overall, it's more likely that God exists. Now, what he's done is he's narrowed down to where he's only focusing on the problem of evil. And so it leaves aside all of those other potential arguments, which would make God's existence more likely. And what he's done here explicitly in that clip is just said, I'm going to bracket all of those other arguments. And the question is, why would you do that? There's no particular reason that he gives for it other than saying, I'm going to assume that all of those other arguments, just set them to the side. I'm only worried about the problem of evil. And again, if his thesis is that given gratuitous evil, it makes the existence of God relatively less likely, that's fine. I think that's probably, that's a true claim. What it gets you is not very much, because then we have to look at that claim in the context of all the other claims about God and all the other arguments that we have.
Okay. With that in mind, let's keep going.
We're here talking about I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God. But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here. Then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody, and wants to love everybody, and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable. Look, you might be able to justify an amount of suffering, right? But the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia, and they're dead...
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
Then perhaps then the parents should be grateful that their
now
child
I'm
got
going to
leukemia.
interject. This is the theology I was raised with. What that guy in the white just said, right? Well, maybe there's a bigger issue. Maybe that child dying from leukemia brought them to God. Like, I would agree in this case with Alex. If that's the God we're talking about, so, yeah, I'm out, bro. I'm out. And so I think that, you know, as Alex is talking, he's talking about the Christian God, he's really riffing off of a pretty, I would argue, a pretty typical understanding of the evangelical God, at least, you know, about how I was taught to view God as someone who grew up in Calvinism, but more into charismatic circles. There was always this, well, there's a deeper meaning behind this horrible thing that is tragic. And, you know, to me, I think more and more likely, I'm like, yeah, dude, like, I mean, I have 2 kids. I'm sure a lot of us have kids. Yeah. If the all-powerful, all-good, all-loving God, who could do anything he wants, set it up so my kid had to get leukemia and I watched him suffer to death in the most horrible way possible, and then I die and end up in heaven, and God goes, well, I just did it so you can get closer to me. I'd be like, what? Like, that doesn't, the math ain't mathing on that.
Well, and that's why again, having time to unpack a lot of ideas is so important, and why it was so difficult in this format to do that. Because it sounds like you and I agree, Kevin, about more of like a disjunctive model of creation where God might create something like an initial world segment, and then from there, what actually obtains is not out of like deterministic or fatalistic outcomes, but the modal landscape of what kind of like world actually obtains is going to be in virtue of non-deterministic, non-fatalistic actions. And that's going to be important for part of the explanation here. But man, those answers are just so frustrating to listen to when I was sitting in the chair too.
Which one? Alex's answers or the other guy's answers?
Just in general, because people were trying to do the whole like Frank Turek, like, well, why is this bad if there's no God? Because without God, you can't have like morality, and kind of that kind of an answer.
Well, can we just park here for a second? Because I think this is really important. Even the people in the chat, right, who are like really pushing back hard here, I think that is, whether it's true or not, that is at least at a minimum the perception of the kind of God we're talking about, because there are these apologists who are very successful and well-funded and make these kinds of arguments, right? And it makes sense, and I know all 3 of you are mature enough and smart enough to understand that it makes sense in that case why so many would leave the idea of God completely and go to maybe more where Alex is, right? Because you're right. Some of the answers I gotten were just were tragic. I mean, dude, John Piper wrote a book saying that God sent COVID. God's judgment is on the world, and he sent COVID. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, wait, you mean like the people who died, you know, through ventilators or got lung transplants, people who had to watch their loved ones pass away through glass, that was all done because God's judging the world? I don't want anything to do with that God. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I think that's really what Alex is pointing out here.
But let me say something to that. So go ahead, Kevin. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Aaron.
So I just want to say something about the fact that part of what I would say you're diagnosing exactly correctly, Tim, is what I refer to as the binary logic by which we take up these debates. So for me, like the idea, which again, the chat is very frustrated by the title for this event. And the whole point is, it's not that he lost because his opponent won. For me, the thought is, no, we all are less benefited when we think that what engagement looks like is a zero-sum game of binary options. And so part of that mode is what my own evangelical backdrop taught me, right? You are either this kind of Christian or you are an atheist.
Right.
And all that I would try to encourage people to think about is, when we abandon that God, it turns out that there are a whole bunch of alternatives that lots of moral, interesting, smart, reflective, humble people have articulated, right?
Yes.
And so the worry that I have, where we started about this format, and I said maybe apologetics as such. So my view is that the very act of giving theodicies is itself a contribution to the amount of evil in the world. Because what that does is invites people to think, oh, you've now said I'm irrational if I keep thinking that something's wrong with a God who would kill my child or that would let my child die, however we frame it. And I want to say, yeah, if that's what the theodicy does, as opposed, by the way, to
define
defenses.
theodicy. Define theodicy.
So theodicies are arguments for what God is like, such that this suffering, this evil, this natural reality, this misery is justified, right?
Got it.
To justify that in light of this account of God, I think is actively adding to evil.
Yes.
But philosophers don't often give theodicies. What they give are defenses trying to show that a particular model of God that you claim, or one claims to have been defeated by a particular version of an argument, may not go through in the way you think it does. And that's why when I say apologetics in scare quotes is best done and best left to the professionals, that's not at all saying, oh, we've got this figured out, everybody else step off. It's the exact opposite. It's trying to say, when we do this without the decades of wrestling with the nuance that is annoying all the watchers of this video right now, we will necessarily fall into the binary logic that makes Alex so successful. And for what it's worth, that makes Trump so successful.
Right.
It's win, 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 lose, lose, lose.
Right.
And that's what makes evangelicals tempted by Christian nationalism, because it's a matter of there has to be a they that we oppose in order for us to stand as winners.
Yeah.
This is what in political philosophy we would refer to as a kind of Carl Schmittian notion of antagonism. But there's lots of reasons to think antagonism is not actually the best option for human engagement.
Right.
So thinking differently about real disagreement, and disagreement being what makes possible the respect for the other, right? The fact that, Tim, I think you can be wrong about this is part of what it means for me to take you seriously as a friend.
Well, I'm not
right?
wrong though, Aaron.
So,
we all know this. You're on my show. Nope. I'm always
It
right.
is a Wednesday. You're all infallible on Wednesdays. But anyway, the whole point is apologetic discourse, when done as a corporate enterprise, whether by professionals like Bill Craig, right, or by, in my opinion, amateurs like Alex O'Connor, the critique is not, oh, he's an amateur. The critique is, when we're doing this as a mode of corporate engagement, the binary remains, and all we've done is taught people to think winning and losing is the point of engagement. And I think that's where I just really get nervous.
Yeah,
I have thoughts on that, but Dan, go for it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say something that, because you said something that I actually feel really passionate about. Because I do have a theodicy, and I agree with what you're saying, because it depends on how you package and what you're actually trying to do when you do a theodicy. For instance, you brought up Bill Craig, and Craig likes to make this distinction between, and a lot of philosophers do, from what I've seen, this distinction between like the philosophical / evidential problem of evil, and then the emotional existential problem of evil. But my approach to the problem of evil is a sufferer-centric approach rather than an event-centric approach. And I think the process of theodicy should be something, if you're going to give one, right, should be something that offers hope and empowerment to the sufferer rather than some sort of moral offsetting balance to what happened to them. Because I think the most important thing that happened like about a person is not what happens to that person, but what that person becomes and how they found meaning in those events and the meaning making process, all that stuff. And I'll land the plane here, I promise. But the main point I want to bring out here is like you actually said that the Odyssey is like almost like adding evil to the world. And I would agree with that. Because of the inverse, I also think is true. I think when people talk about the problem of evil and objectify and further re-victimize sufferers in these discourses, I think that also perpetuates the evil and suffering that goes on in the world as well. Because, again, for instance, I take gratuitous suffering to be a type of suffering that would render it impossible for an agent to look back on their life and still consider their life worth living. Like that's what I take gratuitous to mean. So I take like Chisholm's approach and then like Marilyn McCord Adams and stuff like that. And so the whole point I'm trying to make here is like, well, who am I to say whether or not that agent can do that? And who is the atheist? Who is Alex to say whether or not the agent can do that? All I'm doing when I give a theodicy is saying, hey, here's the meaning that you could theoretically find if you find yourself in an instance of horrific suffering, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I would just
say, leave God out of it. Love people. Yeah. And atheists and Christians and Buddhists and Baha'i and agnostic find a way to love each other. And in doing so, we live out the hope that we take to be real in the world. And so the claim is not, oh, here's a refutation of theodicies, right? It's more to say, when we think that's what's needed in those moments, I think we've misunderstood how the existential problem of evil is really just a matter of humans being bad at existing with each other, right? And that's where I'm trying to suggest, as a professional philosopher of religion, it turns out that most times we are probably better thinkers if we leave the arguments in some sense at home and say, you know what, I'm going to walk with you through this. And I know that will disappoint people because, hell, that's the worst possible thing for getting likes on a video and monetizing it and making money in the corporate frame, right? But it might be the case that the only reason thinking well matters for Socrates is because it helps us live lives that we were okay having lived. I'm down with that. I'm there. And by the way, it's one thing, just for a comment in the chat, that it's a wild take to call a guy with a bachelor's in philosophy an amateur. I don't know how to respond to that. As opposed, like, I'm not a fan of Bill Craig. He's a kind of friend of mine, but I'm not saying he's excellent or good at this. I'm simply saying, like, go read his books on B theory of time. Like what it looks like to, as Will Smith says, pay dues so folks pay attention. The PhD's not paying your dues. That's what you do so you can. So the idea that someone with a YouTube channel and an undergraduate skill in philosophy is somehow taken as a professional, I find offensive as a matter of course. That's like saying to my mechanic, hey, bro, I watched YouTube. Yeah. I can fix my own truck. That's bizarre to me. So I'm not suggesting Bill Craig is good, that he's right. I'm just saying, unless we take seriously, and Tim, I love you, I'd lay in traffic for you, but unless we take seriously that being an influencer does not constitute expertise, then we're garbage thinkers to begin with.
Why do you think I brought you on? Why do you think we do our, and I mean that, like if a lot of people who follow our work know, we are always having scholars, academics, theologians, sociologists, people who have credentials, and not because it's not an elitist thing. Okay. It's not, it's the same logic of why I trust my doctor over Googling my symptoms. It's the same thing, right? My doctor has gone through training. There's checks and balances. There's a world that he understands better than I ever could. And so when we
they're
talk about
most likely they're the most likely to be able to realize they should be very humble about their claims. My issue with Bill Craig is he's not. Like, I've got professional issues with him for that reason, right?
One of the things I've realized doing this work now, I've had the privilege of interviewing probably 250 plus academics over the course of a few years. I've noticed that people with PhDs or who are in good faith tend to use not binary or extreme words. What I don't hear Pete Enns say is the Bible is objectively clear. It's more of, well, here's the academic consensus. Here's what we found to be the most true. Here's the evidence, right? And you're totally right. I have found that most people I've had on this show who are not that way, who are more in maybe a binary or fundamentalist way of thinking, who think they have all the answers, they're the ones who tend to be the most extreme. And I want to be honest to the audience really quick, because maybe you're new here to the show. Maybe it's your first time watching this stream and you're like, what the hell am I watching? Just so you know, the New Evangelicals, we're a nonprofit organization. We do three things. We help people find a better path forward in their faith, away from fundamentalism. We advocate for accountability inside the church, and we hold space for folks who have been hurt by the church. That being said, one of the analogies that we use often is a lot of us grew up like in this basement of Christianity. We thought we knew all there was. We thought we had all the right answers, and we were taught that above ground was like a desert wasteland. There was nothing there. But when we actually walked up the stairs, for whatever reason that motivated us, we found out that there was a whole house of Christian thought full of rooms and universes and with writings and theologians and scholars. And then we realized that we're actually one house in a neighborhood full of other ways of being. And so the reason why we're doing this live isn't to take a big old shit on atheism, of course not, but simply to give people other options besides the binary many of us are given of either you're this type of Christian or theist, or you are just an atheist, right? And we want to just say, hey, people land where they land for all kinds of reasons, but there are other ways to think about and conceptualize God, theology, what God is like, what God isn't like, and still even be somewhere in the Christian house that doesn't accept the notion that God gave my kid cancer and therefore God is still good. That's all we're trying to do here. So what I did was, when I saw the Alex O'Connor debate, and I talked to Than a little bit because him and I have talked for a while. Kevin and Aaron, we talk all the time about on the show. I said, let's just have the massive conversation publicly. We would do this privately. I would call the three of you late night on Zoom. We'd have some whiskey and we would talk about this probably for 6 hours. Okay. But I said, let's just do it live so people can hear what it's like, right? No one here is attacking Alex as an idiot or saying he's so stupid or atheism is untenable. This is not an apologetics live. This is simply giving people some other ways to think about what Alex said, and also not being afraid to critique some of the Christians and their very unappealing answers to these questions. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Can we keep going? Because it's an hour and 18 minutes into this video.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's
So
no
much
day
fun.
here. My kids are waiting on me.
That seems
All right,
obscene
pause.
to me.
Just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort.
That's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Would you say?
Really quick, we're still on the same topic of suffering. Is there more you want to talk about, or can we get to the next topic here? Because he talks about other things I think are way more compelling, and I feel like we kind of beaten this horse. But if you wanted to keep talking about it, we can. What do you three want to do?
That's good. I'm fine to go forward. I would just say that I thought his point there was entirely fair, well stated. It's a burden of proof argument, so it's trying to shift what we can take as a default rather than what we would have to conclude as a result of evidence. And I think he's, to be honest, right about kind of where we would land on that. So that is one of the spaces where I really do think he says it well. I just think that the idea, therefore, here's this argument why, like, no, what I'm going to be doing in that moment is not talking to somebody about what's plausible. I'm probably going to either be making sure my friend's okay or running down the freaking street to try to get his wallet back. Right. And that's where I think the idea of doing this work as a debate space is the real abstraction. That's the real thing that gets frustrating, rather than understanding it as, this stuff's hard. And I think he does a good job of explaining it.
I love this comment. Someone says, honestly, I'm hoping that some of the things Alex said in this 1 verse 25 will cause some of those Christians to deconstruct. LOL. And yes, I'm dying. That's funny. I want to give anyone here the last word before we move on. Are you all good? Can we move on to the next topic? Are we cool with that? All right, good. All right, move on.
Sure.
Let's see. All right, claim 2. Let's get to claim 2. Oh, the God command.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Here we go.
Commands genocide in the
back up a little bit here.
birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
Of course, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff,
Right.
then there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff.
Right.
So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right.
My next claim is that God commands genocide in the Bible.
So it's in there, right? And I would say this is a great place where things like progressive Christianity service.
Go ahead.
And this, I promise, is not going back. It's just to say, everybody notice what he did in that last move was to take us back to a logical problem of evil that he had earlier said was not really what he was arguing about. So again, this is what we mean by saying it's not a matter of did he win or lose. It's a matter of if we're really going to think this stuff through, it's unlikely that 20 seconds in front of him that you're going to say, well, wait a minute. But now you're slippery in your premises, right?
Yeah,
so anyway, let's talk about genocide now.
All right. I'll save my thoughts for this later.
Well,
back up a little bit here. We'll start again.
Right.
Next claim is that God commands genocide in the Bible.
So it's in there, right? And I would say this is a great place where things like progressive Christianity serve us quite well. Not in the idea that God is progressing, but humanity is progressing further to a greater understanding of God's ethic and justice. I would also say when I look at scripture, I would actually be opposite from most of my contemporaries here. I don't read it as 100% literal. Like, I don't need scripture to be a history book, a literal book. So I look and I have to say, well, what is this telling me? I think that God is ultimately always pulling us toward greater levels of justice. And when we look into this story in history, like, I think people are recording a potentially historic genocide that they are trying to make sense of in their religious worldview. And so they're superimposing language for God.
Do you think that God commanded this to happen?
I am not super interested in that conversation, but I would say potentially.
Okay, so
Interesting.
this is, I don't understand. This is what I don't understand about that move, because I actually think like everything up to that was fairly good. Like the claim that, people are progressing, people have understood God differently in different times, people understand morality differently in different times. Like, all of that is true. Understanding that the Bible is not literal, all of these things are really good. And then he gets to the end and Alex says, so do you want to say that God didn't command genocide? And he's like, I really don't. It's like, why not at the end just say, I believe that genocide is bad, and that if the text says God commanded it, that's not accurate. God did not actually ever command genocide in a literal way. Why not just make that move all the way and accept it?
Or go in a more, in this sense, something that the Jewish tradition of Talmudic debate is better at than the Christian tradition of biblical interpretation. You could also say, even if God commanded it, God was wrong. Right, like it might be the case.
Whoa! Everyone's triggered. All the Christians are triggered.
Here. So I just want to point out, like, again, the binary that it's either yes or no commanded. Well, it could be the case that yes commanded but was a mistake. Yes commanded and God regrets having commanded it. Yes, God wished it had turned out a different way. God tried. Like, there's so many possible threads here. And I want to make clear, I'm not a biblical literalist. I think biblical hermeneutics is complicated. This is why I do philosophical hermeneutics, is because I think ultimately very little is obvious. And whenever we act like the Bible is clear, we probably are wrong. Here. And that's where, ironically, Alex is the most literalist of anyone in this video. And that drives me insane, not because I think he's wrong about the claim, just the interpretive frame is the thing he's rejecting.
Dan, let's go to you. Go ahead.
You're going to notice that issue later on in this clip too. I think his hermeneutic approach in general is very flawed, because I think he reads the Bible as a 21st century British guy, rather than having the ancient Israelite or the Second Temple Jew in his head when he's reading the Bible as well.
Yes, I have a thought on this. A thought. I finally can keep up. Okay, whew, thank God. I'll tell you, that evil one, I was like, what the hell? Jesus, I was like, yeah, all these names and terms. Like, yeah, of course, guys. Carl so-and-so. Yeah, of course, whatever. So, one of the things I realized deconstructing my faith, because I'm not, I mean this sincerely, I'm not sure where you are, if you would be like more conservative than me on certain biblical things or whatever, but I'll just say where I was. What's up?
Oh, yeah, you're saying where I would be?
Yeah, like I'm just saying I'm not sure where you would be in this. So, I'll get your thoughts on it.
I don't even know what those labels mean anymore, to be honest, man.
Totally fair. So I grew up, though, being told very much like the famous William Lane Craig kind of argument, that like if God commanded something, by definition, it's automatically moral and good. And that the stories in the Bible, including the Hebrew Bible, all happened literally, etc. What I learned as I explored and listened to more Bible scholars is that actually what evangelical fundamentalism is doing is it's actually mapping on its own modernist framework onto a text that is not modernist, right? Like the world of the Bible, John Walton says, right, written for us but not to us. It's a whole different universe and way of thinking about history, about God, about the divine, about how God moves through the world, about prophecy, etc. And so I actually felt proud of myself, because I was like, Alex, on this, you're actually playing the same game as the fundamentalists are that I grew up listening to, but you're actually taking it to its logical conclusion and calling it out loud, right? What you're saying is that these stories happened literally, and therefore God is bad. And what I would say is that, I don't know if those stories are supposed to be taken literally, if they even happen that way, and if they're not trying to get to a greater theological or even mythological point from the Hebrew perspective, right? A group of people who were always usually marginalized, under occupation, under empire, and waiting for the day for their God to save them. And so that was an interesting piece here where I thought, I get the point of the question, but it is flawed from the start, because it's putting on a modernist post-Enlightenment framework onto a collection of texts that have no such framework on them. To put it in evangelical speak for my audience, it's like when people read Genesis 1 and 2 literally and say, and therefore the earth was created in 6 literal days. Well, the biblical authors were not scientists. They had no scientific worldview. That's not what they're getting at. They see the world through order and chaos, not through a physical material, how did we get here? That's my thought on that. How'd I do?
Yeah, very good. I think that's exactly right. Now, the thing I would add to that simply is it's important to understand that when he plays that game, and you're right to say he does it by taking it to its logical conclusion, I actually think that's where I find him very compelling. Mm-hmm. The problem is I don't think that the meta explanation that that's what's happening is necessarily embraced by the audience to whom he's speaking, right? To say, hey, what this is showing is the unsustainability of your hermeneutics.
Right.
Yeah. And that's where I just tend to go like, if that's the point, I'm all in. I think he does a really good job at making that move.
I didn't get to go up for this one, which was really disappointing, and I really wanted to, because this is what I wanted to talk about, which is that meta level discussion. But also, in hindsight, I don't know that I would have gotten too far anyway, because I would have wanted to go into some hermeneutics and criteria for how to assess different things.
Right.
And that just would have gone nowhere. I would have gotten voted. People would have gotten so bored so fast.
For people out there who are interested, I recommend this book. It comes pretty recommended. It's called A History of the Bible, the Books and Its Faith by John Barton. It's been a really respected, kind of intro primer to how we got our modern day Bibles. And I'm telling you guys, you can read 100 pages in and be like, oh, this is way more complicated. So I just think that's really important as we navigate the Bible in general, whether you're a person of faith or not. Let's do our best to take the Bible and any ancient text on its own terms to understand what's going on, and then we can think about interpretation and what do we do with it. But I don't think it's fair to map on our modern ideas about history, morality, and context, and science onto collections of texts that really have no such framework and are not claiming to be such.
All right. And Kevin has Kevin has a great book forthcoming on precisely the ethical ramifications of this very point.
Oh, well, I have Jesus and Gender, which is about how, which includes discussions of how gender was discussed in the Bible and how we should think about it today.
Fair enough. All right, let's keep it going here.
Can I recommend 2 books really quick?
Yeah.
Or actually just 1 book, I guess. If anybody wants to, I'll do 2 things actually. Yeah, one book that I would recommend for people that want to know about the war text specifically. Matthew Lynch has a book called Flood and Fury. I wouldn't endorse everything he says in there, but I think it's like a really good starting point if you're trying to understand the narrative structure of what's happening in those texts. And if you want to get really dorky, there's a scholar named Christine Hayes who has a lecture series. If you just type in Christine Hayes Old Testament lecture series, must listen to if you want to understand what's going on here.
Sounds great.
Okay, because
when we look at Christian theology in the full, when Adam and Eve decide to disobey God, technically we're all, subjected to death, subjected to the wages of sin, the penalty of sin. Because we fell, I know this is a very unpopular thing. God can do whatever he wants, right? Whether it's, genocide, putting us to death.
Do you think that applies to like infants?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. I know it's an unpopular opinion.
God. So you think infants are deserving of the treatment they're given in 1 Samuel?
I think because we all fell, yes.
Okay, really quick.
Holy
shit!
That's a horrible view. Just to
that
be
guy
clear.
said that for real?
Yeah.
I went up to
view.
this guy afterwards and I told him, like, man, you're gonna have your name plastered all over the internet with those words attached to it. Like, you got to be ready for that.
I mean, if people are wondering how people say justify like genocide or maybe the treatment of us carpet bombing Gaza, you are looking at the theological framework many Christians will cite to justify what we're seeing today. Like that. I mean, but to be fair, he's just being logically consistent with what he was taught and does not know how to actually interrogate his own claims.
And importantly, Bill Craig, who we've been both elevating as a model, maybe, and also I'm now going to critique very deeply, he actually gives a substantive version of that view that I find horrifying, and we should stand against. So when I, again, earlier said, the professionals are good, that doesn't mean they're right. It's just that you can be logically coherent. If your premises are true and you've got a valid argument, then your conclusion must be true. That doesn't mean all your premises are true, right? And so this is the sort of nuanced work it takes. If you start with meticulous providence, which Bill Craig technically does not, but that's a more complicated issue, then the kind of thing that you arrive at, it's a horrifying answer. It's not technically irrational if you start with certain premises. And that's the thing that the binary logic it occludes. You can't see that well enough, right?
This is actually a really important piece, and I'm going to try and flesh this out in layman's terms, so bear with me. Maybe, Aaron, you can interpret. But oftentimes we ask ourselves, man, how could people who do horrible things justify what they do as horrible? Like, how does the Holocaust happen, right? How does a nation, how do guards, how do people come to these ideals and not see what they're doing? And I think you made a great point that things can be rational and logical, but still terrible, inhumane, evil outcomes, right? There was a logic to how people in Nazi Germany thought about Jewish people that led them to the justification of those actions. It wasn't just some random act of chaos. There was a whole worldview built out about that people group and why ultimately they deserved it. And by the way, Hitler doesn't start out that way. It starts out with just some light anti-Semitism. Oh, they're annoying. Oh, they're this. Oh, they're that. It grows over time, and the justification becomes logically sound for Hitler. I say that because we have to understand that, to your point, Aaron, people, academics or not, can create logical structures that make sense, but still have inhumane and evil consequences. And that's a very important piece of this.
And it's also important to realize, and this is Hannah Arendt, it might be the case that it's not even a matter of substantive logical accounts and them remaining internally coherent. It may just be banalities of finding your way in what is accepted as normal in your spaces, right? So even the idea of doing horrifying things, like how could we get there? Well, rarely does someone, immediately say, man, I think drugs are awful. I would never. Ooh, but maybe meth, right? Like the idea of gateway behaviors being why Christian nationalism is unrecognized by most of the people defending it. It's because they've been for 40 plus years in America educated in youth groups to understand a very particular Americanized version of Christianity as just what the Bible clearly says. And so when that becomes horrifying, or it starts becoming a kind of justification for supporting genocide, or not supporting reproductive rights, or not supporting our LGBTQ friends, like suddenly that was never the question. The question was, well, I'm just trying to be a good Christian and make it through my teenage years in the youth group. And that banality is part of what I think that this dude's answer reflects. Is I don't think he's genuinely in any other context going to defend the goodness of infanticide, because he would find that morally reprehensible. Right. But in the context of, but you've just said X and you've just said Y, so then don't you, like, oh crap, well, yeah. And that move is part of the thing that I think we all have to be careful about. David Foster Wallace, in This Is Water, one of the, I think, most important works of all of philosophical history, is basically saying, look, if we don't interrogate what we take for granted, then we are fundamentally unable to recognize that what we take for granted could have been otherwise. And that's the power of philosophy as a public good, right? Yeah. I don't want more professional philosophers. There's probably way too many of us. But I do want philosophers being, in public spaces all the time. And that's because we put question marks where everybody else puts periods, and we start being able to push back on the binaries in ways that open up not just more interesting views, but more loving, caring, hospitable, and inclusive communities.
Yeah. Van, any response to that? I want to make sure you have a time if you want to add on or anything.
No. I mean, Aaron, let me know what you think about this, or because I'm not a philosopher in the sense that like I've earned the PhD or anything like that. But what I do consider myself to be, and what I try to be, is the person that can bridge the gap between the philosophers or the historian and the average person. And I'm trying to just translate the ivory tower nonsense. That way people can actually do the hard work together.
I think Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau's the right move here. He says there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but no philosophers. So what I want are more philosophers as mechanics and surgeons and influencers and politicians and barbers, right? What I'm not suggesting is that we need more professors of philosophy. What I am suggesting is that if we're going to do the kind of nuanced, rigorous engagement that is presenting itself as natural theology, well, then in the same way that I don't want my barber operating on me as a surgeon, I should probably be careful not to think that, my favorite YouTuber is probably the best resource for understanding the sophistication of arguments. That's the claim, right?
Cool. Listen, we have to keep moving on. This is great. Let's keep going.
This claim is that there is insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection.
Oh, I know that guy.
Okay, I want to say something really quick.
It's you, Dan.
Dude, I've been getting so much flack from people for my athletic performance here. Okay. Let me just say something, okay? For those that don't know, okay? I'm 5'7", so I'm shorter, fine. But I also weigh between 175 and 180 and sit at around like 13 to 12% body fat. So I'm just like a really dense guy. I did not want to hurt anybody.
Thank you. The
when
record
I'm
has
moving,
been cleared.
I will plow through people. And you don't see this in the final edit, but there was one time that I actually tried to get to the chair and move through people, and it's like time went into slow motion because I hit somebody by accident and they went flying, and I see this dude flying away from me because I lowered my shoulder, and I see the chair next to me, and I'm like, I can't do this, and I decided to catch the guy instead.
Dude, that's hilarious.
Okay, we got it. And I was like, no, not again, man.
you were Saquon Barkley in this live. You didn't want to hurt anyone. I totally understand. Okay, let's hear what you had to say.
Okay. Nice to meet you. How's it going?
In my experience, it kind of boils down into two categories: the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus and the data itself.
So what I'm really interested in is the historical case
hold
for the
on
resurrection
there.
of Jesus.
Okay,
I'm trying. Hold on.
Clarifying question.
Good.
Can you say something about what you meant by those two?
Oh yeah. Oh man.
Can I play it again so the audience can hear it? Make sure we're on the same page. One more time.
Yeah.
Because it was kind of quick.
Okay. Nice to meet you. How's it going?
In my experience, it kind of boils down into two categories: the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus and the data itself.
So what I'm really
Okay. So you wanting me to clarify kind of like where I'm coming from when I'm asking that question?
Yeah. What's the prior probability and what's the data?
Yeah. So in my experience, like when we're talking about this, somebody might take like a human approach to the resurrection of Jesus and just be like, well, look, just dead people stay dead. So it doesn't even matter if the gospels are reliable and they're actually rooted in eyewitness testimony. No testimony is ever going to be enough to overcome what the low prior probability is of any kind of miracle in general. And so like in simpler terms, right, the prior probability is just going to be the probability that Jesus rose from the dead, independent of the evidence that we have in the gospels and Acts and even like modern day miracle claims or something like that. Like that's just going to be the probability that Jesus rose from the dead, given what you know about the world. And then when I talk about the evidence itself,
which is zero, right? I'm just making sure I'm tracking your argument. Like the prior probability of someone rising from the dead, given what we know about the world, would be zero. Yes.
On a human ground, right.
I'm just making sure I'm tracking the argument. Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, and I would push back against that number, but that's going to be getting into mathematical weeds. We can talk about that if you want to. And when it comes to the data itself, right, all I'm really saying is like it comes either down to the priors or it comes down to what you think about the gospels. And then that's the reason I trailed off into that second question I had about the historical reportage model, because if we have that model, then we have all these testimonies and yada yada yada. And if Alex says that's not enough, well, I want to talk about the priors then, right? Because it doesn't really matter what I do about the gospels. It's going to come down to whether or not you think the prior probability is too low to be overcome by the evidence. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So the way that I usually think
Interpret,
about it,
please.
Yeah. So here's the deal. If you just think Jesus is a normal guy, right? And then you say, okay, what are the chances that a normal guy was dead for 3 days and got up again and then walked around, right? I think we all agree the chances of that are absolute zero, right?
Right.
The chances that, and oftentimes this is the way that it's put. Well, what if your aunt like died and got up after 3 days, right? And for me, the only way that something like the resurrection becomes plausible at all is if you're already a Christian. So like if you've got background beliefs that say, wow, there is something very special about Jesus, right? There is something, so you believe already that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's something unique, and that he's the kind of person that unique things would happen to, and that's the only way that it becomes plausible. So it depends what you bring to the question. What we were saying, like Hume is a philosopher who brings to it the assumption that, this is just a normal guy. And then the chances of the resurrection are zero. So no matter what evidence you give me afterwards, I'm not going to believe it, because I would never believe that a normal guy got up after 3 days of being dead. Right. And so it takes it out of the context of the Christian narrative, of Christian background beliefs. And then if you take it out of that, it's improbable and it's never going to happen. I mean, that's just the way it is.
But interestingly, though, right, Kevin, the analogy, I think, in terms of arguments for the divine, which is an argument that Alex discusses in lots of detail on other videos, is the fine-tuning argument, right? Where the whole idea is if by the fine-tuning argument mean, well, if we assume theism, then the probability that the world would turn out the way it is becomes 1. And if you assume atheism, the argument is, well, it's basically 10 to the 40th, 1 in 10 to the 40th. So you end up with the argument cutting in that direction. Alternatively, if we say here, well, if we start with typical normal beliefs about the way humans' bodies work, the probability is 0, or something like 1 to 10 to the 40th, right? I mean, maybe there is some evolutionary development that possibly there is regeneration. So, but it would be basically impossible in normal discourse. Alternatively, if you start with an assumption that says, given that this person is in fact God incarnate, for whom physical realities are not binding, the probability is 1 that those physical realities do not apply, right? And so
what do you think
that's,
about this,
I think, why it's tricky.
Yeah, I think it gets really messy and really murky really quickly. Because, correct me if I'm interpreting you wrong, Aaron, because I just kind of take this to be almost like an enumerative induction type argument, right? Where you have this reference class of humans, and then within the reference class, you have this occurrence of people rising from the dead, and you're going to say the observed amount of those occurrences is 0, right? And that might be one way of measuring the prior probability of the resurrection. But like what Kevin said, is in your background, you have Christianity is true. Well, that's going to change something. I think the way that you measure out the priors is going to be really contextually bound to a lot of different things. I don't know that you have to assume Christianity even. Like, for instance, Alex likes to argue from divine hiddenness, right? Like, given theism, you're going to expect some sort of divine revelation. This is where I could make like a type token distinction, right? And say, well, if you have the type divine revelation, the token of incarnation and subsequent resurrection would be of that type. It's not going to make the priors of the resurrection of Jesus to be drastically high, but it is going to inform us on the prior probability in some way, shape, or form, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so when you're assessing priors, I think there's so many things that you can kind of take into account, because
I want to get to the rest of your video soon, Than, just so you know, guys.
I'll end up really quickly. Because if you're just going to go based off of like statistical probability rather than like other types of probability, you might run into some counterexamples. Like, so like theoretically, for instance, like let's just say I had a spring, right? And prior to this instance, no springs have ever been sprung. I don't know how else to word it, right? But if I asked you, given what you know about the spring and like the laws of physics and everything, right? Once I compress it and like, oh, what's the probability it's going to do the springy stuff, right? You're going to say 1. Unless you're talking about statistical probability. That's why I'm saying it gets really murky really quickly. But do you get where I'm trying to come from there?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Let's watch the rest of the video, because I think that where it goes is maybe the place that it makes kind of Kevin and I, what we're saying make a little bit more sense.
Let's find out. Here we go.
I'm really interested in is the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay. I want to ask a clarifying question. If I were to give you a model of the Gospels that I would call like the historical reportage model, which would say something along the lines of the authors of the Gospels were close to the times and places of the historical Jesus. They rooted their historical work in eyewitness testimony and did not feel the freedom to make up historical facts. If we were to get there, would that be enough for you to say the probability that the resurrection happened relative to any other countering theory is higher?
Well, if it were true that they were reporting historical events, then it would be a historical event, yeah.
So let me clarify.
I don't think that they are.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. Let me clarify one thing here. The historical reportage model does not entail what the reporting actually happened. All I'm saying is that we can extract from there is that these were the actual eyewitness testimonies to the risen Jesus.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus is the only person?
So I think, and this is, are you pushing him on that because it's a theoretical question? You're trying to get to his background positions, or do you actually want to push for the reportage model of the Gospels that you're advocating?
Yeah, so putting my cards on the table here, Kevin, I'm a horrible rhetorician, right? Like, I didn't have a strategy there. I just wanted to know what he wanted to talk about, and diagnose what the fundamental issue is, and that's all, really. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I mean, these are the two questions, right? The one is, what are your background beliefs, and do they make it more or less likely that Jesus is resurrected? And then second, what do you make of the reliability of the reports about Jesus's resurrection that we get in the Gospels? And so you were advocating there for a position that says there's at least a good case for the reliability of the reports that we get from the Gospels, because under that model, you would assume that they're coming from eyewitnesses and that they're not feeling free to change the details of those reports. So I guess that's my question then is, do you actually believe that about the Bible, or were you just pushing that for to try and get him to his background belief?
No, that's a good question. No, I actually hold to that historical reportage model of the Gospels. And so I kind of argue that on two different forms. One is just going to be I'm going to point to like the texture of the Gospels in Acts. And all I mean by that is it's more reflective of something that's going to be based in somebody's work that is rooted in testimony and trying to give some sort of like historical accuracy to the life of the historical Jesus. And then I further that just through I further the reliability of that through other external confirmations, like what Colin Heemer might do, for instance, in his book of Acts, just in the settings of Hellenistic history. And
Can we keep going?
I mean, I just want to note, because this is not a position that I would hold, like the reportage model. I don't find it convincing. I tend to think that when we look at the Gospels, you can look at, for instance, the birth accounts of Jesus, and obviously we're getting very different accounts from different places across the 1st and 2nd centuries. We're getting 3 or 4 different accounts of Jesus's birth and the context for it, that people are definitely filling in with their own details and doing their own things. We know that Luke is taking from Mark, that Matthew is taking from Mark, and that each one of them are like changing the text in various ways. So I think that I would definitely be more skeptical than you appear to be about that, the reliability of that data.
I actually used to fall in your camp, Kevin, and then through studying this for a while, which that's not me saying you haven't. I just came to change my mind on it. I'm happy to talk about that too.
We could definitely do that in a future live, but we have to keep moving. Keep moving.
Let me just throw a book recommendation out that would explain these debates. It's by my very good friend James Barker, and it's simply called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. So if you want to see a really good account of this, hopefully he's going to be on New Evangelicals soon enough. Woo! That's the one.
Just came in today.
So hopefully a future New Evangelicals guest. Highly recommend it. It unpacks a lot of these debates.
Great.
And outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles rose from the dead, do you think that he's the only person in human history that's risen from the dead?
Yes.
Okay, so Matthew's gospel,
Matthew
really quick
chapter 27, I need to vindicate myself.
Whose phone's Kevin, is that you? Are you okay?
Sorry, there's an Amber Alert in my area.
Go ahead, Dan.
The empirical obviousness of suffering, like the fact that those exist, is showing that suffering is real in the world, right? So and I'm not making light of it. I'm being serious. That's right.
Yes, right.
That pause was not me not knowing the answer to that question. That pause was me going, man, where is he going to go with this, and how can I just keep this sidetrack as minimal as possible?
Yeah,
because you'll later find me making a distinction between resuscitations and resurrections that gets overlooked. But just from the outset, I'm preparing people's minds to see that from that lens, not the he got trapped kind of thing.
Makes sense.
That at the time of the death of Jesus, the graves of Jerusalem opened, and the holy ones got out of their graves, and then, interestingly says, then after the resurrection, appeared to many. Many of them walked around appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
So I would just say that if the historical reportage model is true, then yes.
So you think...
But, hold on. The problem there is those are also talking about resuscitations most likely, not resurrections.
Yeah, but what we're talking about here is the graves of Jerusalem opening and many people getting out of their graves, walking around Jerusalem and appearing to many people.
If I say yes, what's at stake
If this happened, this would be the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in human history. And yet...
And then you're going to make an argument from silence from there.
Some arguments from silence do work.
Okay.
Do you believe
that... do you want to respond to that, Thana?
Yeah, I mean, well, what do you want me to? I'm more interested in what you guys have to say there, because I can kind of go off on my trail on what I think.
I
Here
mean,
and all that,
I take it that what's happening there is you've put forward this reportage model, right? And he's giving you an example that he thinks you will want to deny because you won't want to think that this was actually an accurate report of history, or it seems a very unlikely accurate report of history, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, I find that a fairly convincing argument on his part. But I obviously don't hold the reportage model, which you do. So how would you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So, well, man, this is going to get, I'll say this. I say one of the methodological concerns that I have there is that Alex takes like a pericope by pericope approach, or like a story by story approach. And I would kind of reject that, because I think whatever you take one story to be in the gospel, depending on the genre you put it in and all that stuff, is going to affect the prior probability of whether or not Matthew's intention is to make up a historical fact or not, if that makes sense. And so keeping all that in the background, I think we have a lot of strong reasons to think Matthew didn't make up historical facts for theological reasons. And if the one piece of data that we have to think that Matthew made up the raising of the saints is the silence of the other gospel authors, I see that as at best weak evidence against the historical reportage model. That's like the long story short of it. I take arguments from silence to be pretty weak.
I know we're running out of time, so I want to say something that will be sort of like my maybe closing argument, since I think it's actually, Tim, is a good spot to kind of end the video playback, because it goes into a different direction. I know we're trying to finish by 5, but I think what I find so interesting about what we're seeing is, Fan, you and Kevin are performing exactly what this conversation should look like. Mm-hmm. What should have been filmed is this right here. The context in which you were asked that question, I think, Kevin, you're right. It is a kind of gotcha move, but it's not, I think, bad faith. It's precisely the right move to say, well, look, if you're committed to this, it's Socrates, then you're committed to something you don't want to be committed to, and that's a problem. But what I hope people take away from this conversation is not, oh, we should all run around and do this sort of work all the time. I once had a student who was a football player. I used to be on the sidelines for a lot of the football games at my university. And every single football game, he would try to come up to me and start, so, Dr. Simmons, this Kant, what do you think about deontology? And I kept trying to explain to him, dude, I'm watching football, not the time. Let's go get drinks tomorrow and talk about deontological virtue or deontological ethics, right? Yeah. And the idea that what people might take from this 2-hour conversation of maybe 5 minutes of actual video is not that we have ignored what he was saying or we've not listened to him. It's trying to show thinking is hard work. Mm-hmm. Aristotle says it is hard work to be spoudios, to be excellent. And none of us are excellent, but maybe we're trying our best to become it. And that's not a thing reserved for professionals. That's a thing that is deeply human. Yeah. Excellence is something we should find ways not just to cultivate in our own lives, but that we should create social structures that make it possible for all of the lives of our neighbors. And that work is something that allowing spaces to realize, oh, this is a lot harder than I think that I'm able to do, doesn't mean that you're therefore an idiot or you're stupid or that you aren't welcome in the community. It's actually trying to say, look, this is why we need each other, right? Because it's often the objection that comes from my, parent's neighbor's daughter that causes me to rethink some of the views I hold. But engaging with her about it in the mode in which I do with professionals would be dismissive to her own humanity. So part of what I want us to make sure people don't miss is doing nuanced, rigorous public engagement is not the same thing as doing a debate formatted theater. Yeah. And both have their place, but it's important not to think one the theater is sufficient for ignoring the other.
Yep.
And it's also really boneheaded to assume that listening to people do stuff in professional, rigorous ways means that somehow they are disconnected or dismissive of the fact that that's not how most conversation should look, right?
Yeah.
And that's a thing I just want people to make sure they take away in a time where, expertise is often dismissed as out of touch.
Yeah.
It might just be because, no, we need experts not to tell us what's true, but to show us that simplistic thinking may not be sufficient for questions that are really, really hard.
Yeah.
And experts need people who are experts in other fields to remind them that life and death does not ultimately hinge on what goes on in Kevin and I's classrooms.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So we need each other. And that's where, for me, I appreciate what Alex is doing. I appreciate what Kevin and Tim and Than are doing in different ways. And I appreciate what the people in the comments are doing by taking 2 hours and thinking with us about this stuff.
Yeah.
This is a model of what deliberative engagement in public ways should look like. And I appreciate everybody for being part of it.
Any last thoughts, Kevin or Than?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to double down on that. I think, and I've said, I think that Alex is actually amongst the kind of popular atheists is one of the best that's out there. I don't think this format particularly put him forward well, in that it puts him in a debate format where there's a very short period of time that's leaning towards gotcha moments and leading towards trying to defeat the other person. You're much better off where you have a conversation with other people and you're able to actually develop that out over a long period of time. And he's done that in other formats. And I think that that's much better. I'm sure he didn't have the say over exactly what this format was either. But it's not a format. And this is part of the thing. I don't want to say that the argument from evil doesn't have any effect on Christian belief or anything like that. It's one of the strongest arguments that exists. If the argument from evil doesn't make you question your faith at sometimes, if you're a Christian, then I don't think you're being serious about it. But I also want to be able to hold, the atheists accountable for exactly the way that they're going to make that argument. I don't want to allow them to say, oh, evil exists, therefore God does not, or evil exists, therefore God is unlikely, or just make, overly general claims. Part of philosophy is holding people's feet to the fire to make them say exactly, very carefully what their argument is and to hold them accountable for that. And so that's in large part what we've been doing here, not dismissing entirely the arguments. I think that there are arguments there. I think that he didn't articulate them very well at points. And I think eventually he got to where he was better, but it took him a while to get there. And so that was in large part my problem with it.
And a book I would recommend on, if you want to see accessible, engaging defenses of atheism, but from professional philosophers doing it in an invitational mode, please check out Robert Talese and Scott Aiken's book, Reasonable Atheism. It is fantastic. They are friends of mine. I have co-written with Scott Aiken. We push each other and have for decades. And that book is top notch. If you want to see, I think, the best version of accessible defenses of atheism, that would be where I'd recommend people to go.
Than, what are your thoughts here?
Man, I agree with everything that you guys are saying, to be honest with you right now. I really do, especially just because I'll also just kind of say this. And I think, I think Alex would be fine with me saying this. Alex and I, after this, we both looked at each other and apologized to each other because we did not like what the format did to us. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, if you listen to my interaction with him on the resurrection, but then you listen to, for instance, my public debate I had with Matt Dillahunty, of all people, right? Matt Dillahunty and I had the most loving, cordial discussion. I don't know if you guys have seen that, right? We hugged during the debate. My closing statement was more of a touchy-feely closing statement rather than solidifying my case and stuff like that, right? So contrast what I had with Matt Dillahunty, who historically has had like rough debates with lots of anger and vitriol from both sides at each other, right? And what Matt and I were able to have in that debate with what you saw with Alex and I, where we're constantly cutting each other off, like we're fighting for the mic. And I hated that, what it did to me, right? Like that timer being next to you, having the flags around you, this like the aspect that's going inside my mind where I'm like, okay, well, I have to prove myself here because like this is my shot to get people to like take me seriously enough. Like, I'm not saying that was a good thing that's going on in my head and all this other, but I'm also human.
Right.
And like, I hated what that did to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And Alex felt the same way because we like, again, afterwards it doesn't record. It's not on the final take, but we'd like apologize to each other incessantly after the conversations were done.
Yeah, I mean, listen, friends, first off, let me just say I really appreciate all three of you hopping on. I appreciate you making time out of a very busy day, taking time to look through the video, be honest about it, have a very intense, dialogue that I'm trying to keep up with. I know the audience is, and I think it's really good. I think it's really important that we have these kinds of dialogues. And, Than, I really resonate with what you said. I've been on a few debate style shows before, and I walk away always thinking, I don't like who I became. I felt irrational. I felt like I was trying to jump the gun. I was trying to prove I had the better one-liner. And I just don't like that about me. Like I much rather sit with someone and be contemplative and think deeply about these things. So I really appreciate all three of you coming in. My last thought, and again, friends, I really appreciate you watching the live stream, being here, supporting the work that we do. We are going live tomorrow. Me and April will be live doing our typical recap, talking about all the political, cultural and political stuff that we're seeing. We're talking about the Super Bowl and Elon Musk and all that fun stuff that we just can't wait to talk about. I promise. It's great. But that being said, one thought I had about this is I've been on my own faith journey for a little bit now, kind of just thinking about what do I believe about God, about the Bible, and what actually is the Bible? Like, what do I actually do with these things? I know it's not this inerrant book beamed down from God. I no longer believe that. So what do I do with like some pretty, outlandish claims like the resurrection? And honestly, here's what I've kind of landed with some of this stuff, and you can take it or leave it. I had the pleasure of interviewing John Dominic Crossan, like one of the greatest New Testament scholars, maybe to live in my lifetime. And he said something that always stuck with me. He said, metaphors create realities. We use metaphor as a race of people, as a human species, to create realities about the world that we see. And he was talking about this in the context of the resurrection. And I got to the point where I thought to myself, when it comes to the resurrection, I don't think I have any way to objectively prove if it actually did or did not happen. I don't know. I've even asked conservative apologist Sean McDowell when he was on my show, do we have objective proof that the resurrection existed? And he said no. I said, okay, we're getting somewhere. All that to say, what I've gotten into is that essentially I believe that the resurrection happened. I believe it, but I understand why people wouldn't believe it. But either way, that belief that one day death does not have the final sting creates a beautiful metaphor that I live my life by. That these things are true, and that I, as a Christian, have an obligation to show this love to my neighbor, and to myself, and to my family, etc. That's how I've been thinking about these things. I don't know if I feel like we can be in the weeds all day debating if it did or didn't happen, and here's the arguments. But ultimately, to Aaron's point earlier, how are we loving people? Like, how are we loving our neighbor as ourselves ultimately? Because it's funny, guys. I talk to a lot of academics often, and I really enjoy these kinds of conversations. They are fun and they are helpful. Theology matters, philosophy matters, how we view the world, it matters, no doubt. But this conversation does not change how my neighbor in Philly thinks about the world, and they don't give a shit what I think about this stuff. They don't care if I think the resurrection happened or if it didn't. They don't care if I think Alex smoked the competition or if he didn't. They care about how am I loving them? How am I thinking about their systems, And so that's how I think about this. Ultimately, this is great and important, but if we're not loving our neighbors well, if we're not embodying a love that is inclusive and justice-oriented and looking for the human flourishing for all of our neighbors, what exactly are we doing? So that's kind of my last thought on this. And again, friends, I really appreciate you making time. It means the world. And yes, I am reading your comments here. Someone asked, when is, I was on the Young Turks recently talking to Cenk, and the interview dropped a few days ago. I'll be responding to it later on. But anyway, Friends, we'll be back here tomorrow. I appreciate all your time. If you enjoyed this live stream, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, like this video. Thanks for all of your comments. I'll talk to you all later on. See ya.